This is IBM Museum, and this video is going to be covering token ring cabling, mainly on this page. And let me go through and hide the webcam just so I'm not interfering with anything, get it to where I can interact with the page as well. And I'll include a link to this page at the Arden Tool in the video description. It's a good overview, has some diagrams in there, and there's some cabling that it talks about at this lower point, and that is what I'm going to be covering in this video. I'm not going to be going into so much of the details of what can electrically happen with those cables. Some of the states that if they're not connected, where they go through and bridge wires around, but just a familiarization with the cable types themselves. I'll go through and I'm going to drop off the webcam picture here just so I know that I have the full field of view and there's not any phase things with that webcam picture and the main screen. So this is a type 1 patch cable, and I do actually have some images that I can bring up and show as well, that of the lengths and things like that this come in. I just have the 8-foot length, and for this is actually what they consider a hermaphroditic cable. It can mate, the connector can mate with itself basically, or connect up to itself. And this is mainly used for the MAWs. I've got an 8228 MAW here, and on the connection, the stations together, and also has ring in and ring out ports, are used to link to other MAWs to make the network bigger. And of course, I've been featuring my 8239 that has that in the RJ45 connections, and we'll get talking about these later connection styles and cables as well. But I went through and I did actually pull it's normally these pieces sit flat in here, and they actually prevent you from going through and squeezing to disconnect that side. Now, they even, I could go through and even 3D print more of these if I have to. Nothing but a prevention of going through and for detaching these, and I'll show another method that IBM used as well. But this is the type 1 connector. As we saw, it goes through, it can mate with the same connector style. For the patch cables, you could even go through and daisy chain these things and have something that's long enough. Unfortunately, these do come in longer lengths. And for sometimes they can have on some cables or the devices, we also have one on the 8220s that I featured before. They've got the type 1, and they can have this cover over the ports. The 8228 MAW goes through and it covers not for the station ports, but it goes through and covers the ring in and ring out covers. The 8220 normally has a cover, and these are kind of weird. They go through and they're this like they cover half of the space effectively that this type 1 can go in. But for the type 1 to type 1, this would basically go between MAWs or to extend another patch cable. and it just goes through and plugs in, of course with the covers off and everything else, to the just right in the middle there, and then of course pressing tabs to get that out. And let me go through and I'll pull up the image of that, showing the different lengths and the part numbers and things like that before going through and continuing on to the other cable styles. So I'll have to go through and adjust the appearance of this. I should have got this ahead of the recording, but I've got a few different images there. I'll get myself on the screen while I go over this as well and kind of get it in a position. And it gives the part numbers. This is the 8-foot cable. I've got several of these. They also talk about where this goes into a 30-foot, a 75-foot, and 150-foot lengths, and it features those part numbers. And I don't even know of a source that you could have for these things anymore. I went through and squirreled them away, and they're rather hard working with these things just in these connectors. And of course, IBM had its own way for the patch panels that they went through, and even there's a link I'll put in for a PDF that's up at BitSavers and talks about the cabling, and even shows methods of going beneath the carpet and reveals other details about these type 1s. And that is available for people to look over that PDF and get a little bit more information on how things are for the cabling that IBM did between equipment rooms and where the stations were. They had face plates and things like that. I mean, it wasn't just these cables strung across the floor. I could just well imagine for the heads of these things at the cable end of how obvious that would have been in a workplace environment. But that's the type 1. Now going through to, and certainly these were listed on that that page before. We have the what IBM is referring to as the, well, let's look at, there's another cable that I kind of want to cover just a little bit first. Okay, not necessarily hacking the cable. Okay, and it shows the DB9 connector. I wanted to get to, okay, it was down further. So I'm going to go through and cover this. You know, we covered that bottom one, that ring in, ring out cable or a patch cable. Then I'm going to cover that token ring network to PC adapter cable, because that is what that cable is used for. And get back up with the camcorder screen. I'm going to put this type 1 aside. And going through to the next I have, yes. Okay, so this has the DB9, and it just goes through and populates the outer pins of that. And beard hair again or something there. This is used for connecting up the adapters on the PC to this end, and going through and connecting that to the MAW at the other end. for the station port. And I don't know what lengths that these necessarily came into. And of course, that was if you had the maw out and exposed. I mean, these things are typically in equipment rooms as well. So this would commonly go through to connect up to your a faceplate at your close to your desk, hopefully in that environment if they did the cabling well enough. But it's the same effect here, to where this ultimately was what the DB9 connector being used for on the adapter end. And that connector looks a little bit dinged up. I'd have to go through and straighten that out with my needle nose and everything else to go through and connect it. Now, adapters, I want to briefly cover that aspect as well, to where this is the one of the early. There's also a microchannel version. That this is the 4 megabit speed of token ring. And you're knowing that by it has that green dot. I think I've covered that a little bit before, the aspect of that. But you can have very similar appearing adapters. I mean, these look very, very close. They have components that are close to the same position. And you could go through and be confused, but this is ultimately a more capable adapter here, that it has the 16.4, that's able to do either the 16 megabit per second ring, what they call the ring speed, or the 4 megabit, where this is just the 4 megabit only. And all your stations on that so-called ring of the stations connected to a particular maw at that speed would have to be matched speeds. You could not mix and match the two different token ring speeds on that ring. Now, they had the DB9 connector for the adapter side, and eventually worked to a point where they have both the DB9 and that RJ45 for unshielded twisted pair. This is STP, or shielded twisted pair, in this cable here. This is unshielded twisted pair, or a standard network cabling that's often used for Ethernet now. Now, a bit of the trivia is that when you go to the unshielded twisted pair, when the cabling first came out for interconnecting stations, the category 1 was was the phone, basically twisted pair within phone style cabling that was used for some of the baseband connectors, rated at 1 megabit per second for category 1. Now, people familiar with Ethernet, they are familiar with the Cat 3 and Cat 5 standards for networking. They know that Cat 3 is 10 megabit per second Ethernet, but Cat 2 in this instance was the 4 megabit token ring. If you went to and you had converters, I'll show the media filters later on for going through to unshielded twisted pair, you could run it over cabling that was rated at that Cat 2 standard, which is the 4 megabit token ring standard. Likewise, above the Cat 3 cabling that was common for the Ethernet world, when it was 10 megabit per second, was the Cat 4. And Cat 4 was the 16 megabit per second cabling. And then from there, Category 5 is rated at 100 megabit per second. And that is used, of course, commonly on the Ethernet side. And of course, nowadays it's gone up to higher standards of the gigabit Ethernet, where Cat5e, Cat6, all the other standards that have gone in place since then, whether they're true standards or whether they're just naming conventions by the manufacturers. But that is the kind of the early trivia of the category type wiring, the category cabling, was that Cat2 and Cat4 were the token ring speeds of 4 megabit per second and 16 megabit per second. Now, on later adapters, and these are typically for what's called the auto adapters, which were PCI, there was some microchannel version, there's a microchannel version, even the auto streamers, ISA, PCI, ESA, all these different buses, and they got rid of that shielded twisted pair DB9, just went through to have that unshielded twisted pair, and a lot of time they started coming out with the indicator lights that's very common, like on the Ethernet side, just as a little bit of diagnostics of what the adapter and the cabling is doing there. And again, that's labeled for the 16.4 being the later adapter, and they commonly had that white label on there showing the MAC address and things like that. We did briefly see, and even this has that shielded twisted pair for a connection here, and so there are adapters. It's still, PCI, modern interface, and this 100 megabit capable adapter, we talked about it in a previous video, has that 416 and then the plus 100 to show that it's what ring speeds it's capable of. And that's just a brief indication of those green dots. The green dot is associated with token ring, and just by seeing that and the lettering that may be on there, to knowing whether that could be just a 4 megabit capable adapter, or could be able to run the 16 megabit or even 100 megabit if you had the right adapters and interlinks between the stations. Now, this cable, I'm trying to think if, no, I guess it's the other one that I have. What's the other end? Oh, okay. So that's a good bridge into the next type of cable. And we did see that on that page as well. That's showing that goes through and adapts this type 1. And this even has a cap over that end of that type 1 end. And like I say, it's kind of like a half. It goes through and covers effectively half the space, or it just kind of weird. But this actually has another retention method, that you had these releases here. You'd pull back, and before you can go through and pinch the retaining clips. And these effectively these clips as well, that has the effect of going through and linking basically those contacts as well. It can go through and have an effect on how it does the wiring. There are wrap plugs and things like that for diagnostic that have these same type 1 sort of connectors. They get in well enough into that in that PDF that I'm going to have in the video description as well. But it's just to make you aware, not to go through and struggle where you have this in a plug, and you're sitting there working at it, and you can't get it out. Just being aware that it may have some retention methods to detach it. You know, don't go through and break plastic or anything like that. But this does go through. I mean, it's an excellent seg into the standard unshielded twisted pair cabling type, where IBM would typically show that this is, hey, this is meant for token ring. They just show the green dot. They don't really necessarily show a speed there, but they're meaning that this is effectively for the for token ring, not to get it confused with Ethernet or anything else. And the label at that RJ45 end to go through, and so you're not confusing this with Ethernet, even though this is a little bit thicker cable and things like that. But going through and seeing that green dot, knowing that it's associated with the token ring network. And of course, these are going through and can be used as same thing, going to the link to that faceplate connector and and ultimately to the mall with the type 1 style a lot of the time. And you do have token ring equipment that does have that RJ45, of course, at the other end of the unit, but that you could go through and use standard unshielded twisted pair for the full length. But this would be for this sort of occasion where you'd plug this into the faceplate. Now, I do see this referred to in some cases. In fact, we'll show the media filters here in a moment as well for the cable aspects. And we know that this end is the type 1, and with the reference to the type 3, and type 3 can apparently mean an 8-pin connector like this, and also a 6-pin, as we'll show in a moment. And it may leave you wondering, well, what's the type 2 connection as well? And I wasn't even familiar enough with that, but I asked someone that had worked at IBM in the token ring aspect, and there's even a type 1 faceplate that would be close to your desk. You would go through and plug in the type 1 conductor to that. They have the type 2 faceplate in that case is when you add both the type 1 and the RJ45 port on the same faceplate. And so it looks like it was type 1 with this connector alone, type 2 with both connectors, and type 3 with just this connector. Is the way that the nomenclature was for IBM, is the way of kind of understanding what the missing type 2 aspect would have been. Now, I'll also go through, and the last basic cable I have is this, still in the pack. I do have some of these that are outside the pack, but it's got that DB9 at the one end, and you notice, that's a socket, just like the adapter would have, and then effectively that RJ45 at the other end. And this would basically be to go through where you had the older cabling that went from the type 1 to the DB9 up to your workstation, and you'd have to have an adapter to go to one of these auto, a different little cable segment piece that would go to adapt that DB9 to your auto adapter, since this didn't have the DB9 plug on it. So I've got a few of these, and they're all marked with, this is associated with token ring. This is not for any other sort of connection, not to get it mixed up with anything else necessarily. So one of the aspects we saw with the cables as well, we saw the different types of cable ends. We have these, what are referred to as media filters. And a media filter, kind of a little bit different from that balun that we've seen in a prior video, where it goes from balance to unbalance, is where the name of balun came from. That the media filters go through and they convert it from one cable connection to another. So we have that, this I've shown before with the Pcmca, and I don't even know why. These are marked with that 100 symbol there, and on the end of the cabling for the that the Pcmca adapter uses, there is also 100 marking as well. So these appear to be where they're coupled together, or I don't know if that's just necessarily making it realize that these are rated at 100 megabit per second or something else entirely. But just that association of green and the 100, and of course these to the Pcmca adapters, these aren't 100 megabit capable token ring. It's only that one PCI adapter that I've seen that is capable of that 100 megabit per second. So just get that up there so it doesn't fall. So we have that, and that goes between that type 1 and the so-called type 3, or that RJ45 connection. Although I do have others of that type. This one's kind of interesting because it goes through and it goes from the type 1, and it even goes through and it spins, and of course you can't go all the way around, but it changes that orientation of that piece for some reason for your unshielded twisted pair cabling. And of course this would sit in a maw in a particular way, or who knows, on that faceplate. And it's probably where I can go through and show the images I have for those faceplates as well, to kind of cover that topic of how they appear. But who knows, that had, rotated for some reason. Here we've got one that's got the cover on the type 1 end again. And this is made by Amphenol. And it even gives a little bit of a wiring diagram between the pins and the known wiring colors for the type 1 connector, of those red and orange and green and black, and what is looped back basically on those. And then we get to the media filters that are, these would be commonly used on, and I probably want to show like this one. Like I say, these are identified. It's got type 3 media filter, and it's marked as at 4/16 megabit per second, so you can use either ring speed. Transition engineering, I have other network associated equipment with that, but that's got an RJ11 or a 6 position. So, either the 6 position or the 8 position can be, there is being identified as that type 3 Okay, there's one. Type 3 media filter, and it's got the 8-pin position on that. Now, this one is not marked as a, and it just says it meets at 802.5 specification. I mean, that's a token ring specification for that. And, you know, again, this would a common usage would be to go on an adapter that only has that DB9 connection, adapting that to being able to use unshielded twisted pair. And so of this media filter, I can tell by the connections and the length and everything else. This piece I have separate, and I don't know where the shell of this is, but that kind of shows the components that are on the inside of this media filter for going through and taking the DB9 at one end to going through and putting that over to the leads on the other side of what pins to what pins through that little transformer assembly that's there on the PCB. So that gives a kind of a view of the inside. But these are media filters that go through and they convert one connection type to another and not necessarily work with that balanced and unbalanced side that we saw with like the twin axe, converting that over. But this is more of the converting from what could be a shielded twisted pair connection over to an unshielded twisted pair. And there's still standards that have to be adhered to maintain those particular speeds or be rated at those speeds. And that's what those devices do. But we've seen kind of the variety of the cabling. Now, I do have more of those. We did see that this connection style for the Pcmca adapters, and this works on both that the so-called turbo version. And I wasn't able to get these adapters to be recognized. I have like 5 of them, and they just didn't want to work in the system. And I'm not sure with the surplus lot I got of just they're defunct or something else, but the same connection style works. And we saw, a word on the retainer for that because they are keyed a particular way, and that goes through and latches those. And I don't necessarily treat this as a different style of the token ring cabling. But again, with the green identifier and everything else, you're going to, it's got that association with token ring in the IBM nomenclature. I'll go through, I did get more of these. I wanted to make sure that there were auto adapters. And I did get all my other adapters that are marked as auto to work. But I went through before I found the batch where I had them stored away. And of course I found the cables first and didn't find the adapters until I kind of searched a little bit more. So I ordered some more of the adapters. Knew I had the cabling. I knew I could go through. These have they had a different style shown in. I won't show the invoice. It's the only thing that's left in that box. And probably good enough packaging for these to get. But I saw a different end on these to where it just is a shorter lead. I think these are all identical. And I'll go through and just pull one out. It looks like these are all the 930. We saw how that, what I call the starburst kind of holographic on here, how it can degrade on some of my boards. And I went through and had to use the Goo Gone to get off the labels and things like that. But we see a different style. That latch holds it in pretty good. But these holograms have not degraded at all. That just looks wild. You know, just kind of neat little adapters for those holograms that IBM put on things. And these are all that auto adapter style. And I don't know what the difference at that level is between the so-called auto and the turbo Pcmca adapters. Wasn't able to get working. But in a later video, I'm going to go through, and we've seen some of the adapters, the token ring adapters, and I'm going to show much more, and especially on the side of the ISA bus. We've seen a lot of the microchannel versions as well. And at the Ardent tool, of course, there's a lot to link for the microchannel adapter of the token ring, not necessarily so much for the ISA side, of course. Ardent tool dealing mainly with the microchannel aspects, of course. But there's also the ISA adapters that are the turbo, the so-called turbo adapters. And I'll get testing them kind of side by side. But this shows, it's got that ultimately an RJ11 or 6 position cabling there that it would use. Kind of, it's some weird, heat shrink style tubing that necessarily isn't shrunk as much as it needs to be on that one side of the connector, but just another odd sort of cabling. And I think the ones that I already had for the Pcmca adapters, I've got some cabling I can use for them, and I don't know if I'll get into using these little short ones, but certainly I can go through and incorporate the adapters, and I've got quite a few of these auto adapters now. If I had enough, I could go through and tile a wall and be nice and pretty for that holograph. But let's go through just kind of to close out with the images I have, and I can certainly go through. Let's even bring up back to the page that I'll link in the video description, showing that we've learned the token ring trivia of those category ratings. That's not listed there, but it's just something I knew. But showing the pinouts of these cables. The Type 1 connector, it was on an older version of the page, and I'll go through and talk to Major Tom about where it may have gone to for that, or I can bring back the images for that. So there we've got that one image for the patch cables. Let me go through between the other images that I have just to show the faceplates. Okay, and I mainly wanted to show the aspect of there's that Type 1 faceplate, and go through and you can see that has that Type 1, and evidently there's some kind of Type 9 connector that's very similar, I guess, to that, that is the same size opening or whatever on that faceplate. And this is the Type 2 faceplate. It does have that connection down below that it talks about can be the 3 pair, or in other words 6 wires, or the 4 pair, which is 8 wires, and they're identified as a telephone jack there. That is beneath that Type 1 connector to become a Type 2 faceplate. And I looked through the document that I'll link into the video description. I didn't necessarily see a Type 3 faceplate that I'm assuming would just be that 3-pair or 4-pair telephone jack on that faceplate and be a little bit more standardized out there. Not necessarily for the IBM equivalent, but that seems to be all the Type 1, Type 2, Type 3 sort of convention there. So I hope that this video was informative enough, and if you're entertained, of course, go ahead and click on that like button. If you enjoyed the video, by all means, subscribe to my channel. If you have not done so already, recommend it to your friends that also like this sort of maybe odd content in its own way, so that they can subscribe too. But this is IBM Museum. That's all I have for now. Thank you.